Tonight, we journey to a land where gods walked among mortals, where heroes descended into darkness and sometimes returned, where the questions that still haunt humanity were first spoken aloud in marble temples and olive groves that have long since turned to dust. We drift across wine-dark seas that Homer sang of, past islands where sirens once called sailors to their doom, toward mountains shrouded in clouds that the ancients believed concealed the palaces of immortals. The Greeks gave us more than civilization. They gave us the vocabulary of the soul, tragedy and comedy, philosophy and democracy, the labyrinth of the mind and the thread that guides us home to. These concepts emerged from a people who lived on rocky shores beneath a blazing sun, who sailed fragile ships across unpredictable waters, who built temples to gods they feared and loved in equal measure. Their legends were never merely entertainment, but were maps of existence, attempts to understand why we love and why we lose, why we build and why we destroy, why we reach toward the divine while remaining forever mortal. Before we settle into the evening's gentle journey, before we allow sleep's approach to soften the edges of consciousness, let us stand for a moment at the threshold between our world and theirs, between the fluorescent present and the torch-lit past. Understanding what we are about to explore and why these ancient stories still matter, even in our age of satellites and certainties. The ancient Greeks lived in a landscape that seemed designed by the gods themselves. Mountains that rose dramatically from fertile valleys, seas that could shift from calm to deadly within hours, islands scattered across blue water like stepping stones laid by giants. This geography shaped their understanding of existence. The sea taught them that fate could change without warning. The mountains taught them that some heights were not meant for mortals. The olive groves and vineyards taught them that patience and labor could yield beauty, but only if the gods permitted. They imagined a cosmos organized into realms, Olympus above, where the gods feasted in eternal splendor, the earth between, where mortals struggled and loved and died, and the underworld below, where shades drifted in perpetual twilight, remembering lives they could no longer touch. This vertical universe placed humanity in the middle, suspended between divine and infernal, reaching upward toward meaning while gravity pulled always downward toward dust. Tonight we explore their legends, but we do so slowly, letting each story unfold at its own pace, allowing the ancient wisdom to settle gently rather than rushing toward conclusion. We will visit oracles who spoke in riddles, labyrinths that held monsters born of human shame, mountains where immortals played games with mortal fates. We will descend to rivers that flow through the land of the dead, listen for songs that promise knowledge at the cost of life. Search for cities that sank beneath the waves, carrying secrets we will never recover. We will walk with philosophers who questioned everything, stand before temples that embodied mathematical perfection, follow heroes whose journeys home took longer than the wars they fought. We will learn what the Greeks understood about love that destroys and love that saves, about pride that brings ruin and humility that brings grace, about the strange mercy of limits and the terrible freedom of those who refuse to accept them. The stories we will explore are ancient, but they are not primitive. They represent sophisticated understanding of human psychology, of the forces that drive us toward greatness and toward destruction, of the relationship between individual choice and cosmic fate. Many of these insights about hubris, about the dangers of certain knowledge, about the necessity of facing what we fear, are being rediscovered by modern psychology, being recognized as profound observations about consciousness that our ancestors encoded in myth because they lacked the vocabulary of science. But more than insights, we will explore a different way of being human, a different relationship with uncertainty than our modern culture maintains. The Greeks did not try to eliminate mystery, but lived within it. They did not demand that gods be good or that justice always prevail. They understood that the universe was not designed for human comfort, that the forces governing existence were powerful and often indifferent, that wisdom lay not in controlling fate, but in accepting it while still struggling to live nobly. They understood that the stories we tell about ourselves shape who we become, that a culture's myths are not decorations, but are foundations, that the heroes we celebrate teach us what to value, that the monsters we imagine reveal our deepest fears. They created legends that have never lost their power because they spoke to something permanent in human nature, something that persists across millennia, something that we recognize in ourselves even when we cannot name it. As we move through tonight's exploration, let the modern world's distractions fade. Let go of the assumption that newer means wiser. Let go of the idea that technology has solved the problems that plagued the ancients. Instead, let us enter the Greek understanding that human nature does not change, that the questions worth asking were asked long ago, that the answers, if answers exist, will not be found in novelty but in depth, in returning again and again to the same mysteries that have always defined what it means to be alive, to be mortal, to be human. The pace will be gentle. The details will accumulate slowly. Some chapters will take us to sacred places, others to the underworld, others to the mental landscapes where philosophers wrestled with ideas that still resist final resolution. All will contribute to understanding how an ancient people made sense of existence, how they found beauty and meaning in a universe that often seemed indifferent to human need, how they created stories that have survived not because they are pleasant, but because they are true. True to experience, true to the heart, true to the questions that arise whenever consciousness confronts its own fragility. So settle in. Adjust your pillow one final time. Let the weight of the day release. And prepare to journey to the wine-dark sea, to the slopes of Olympus, to the underworld's sunless rivers, to the ancient wisdom of a people who understood that legends are not escapes from reality, but are the deepest maps of reality we possess. The evening deepens, the myths await in memory, and we begin. In the hours when mist still clung to the mountain slopes above the Gulf of Corinth, when the sacred spring of Castalia ran cold with waters that had never known the sun's warmth, pilgrims began their ascent to the place the Greeks called the navel of the world, Delphi, where the earth itself learned to speak, where vapors rose from fissures in ancient rock, carrying whispers that mortal believed came from the gods themselves. We begin our journey here, at the threshold between the human and the divine, in the sacred space where questions were asked that would shape the fates of empires and the destinies of souls. The site was old before the Greeks arrived, sacred to powers whose names have been forgotten. A place where something in the land itself seemed to pulse with hidden life. The myths told that Apollo had claimed it by slaying the serpent Python, who had guarded the chasm from which prophetic vapors rose. Where the serpent's body fell, the young god established his oracle, and the priestesses who served there were called Pythia, in memory of what had been conquered, what had been transformed from monster into messenger. The temple rose from the mountain side in terraces, each level bringing pilgrims closer to the sanctuary where the Pythia waited. The approach was designed to prepare the soul. The sacred way wound upward past treasuries donated by grateful cities, past monuments commemorating victories won on the oracle's advice, past inscriptions that reminded travelers of truths they would need. Know thyself, carved in stone, nothing in excess beside it. Wisdom so fundamental it seemed carved by time rather than human hands. The journey upward was journey inward, the physical ascent mirroring the spiritual preparation required for encountering what waited at the summit. The Pythia herself was no single woman, but a succession across centuries. Ordinary women chosen for the role, who became extraordinary once they sat upon the sacred tripod above the chasm. In earlier times, she prophesied only once a year, on the 7th day of the month of Bisios, which fell near the spring equinox later. As Delphi's fame grew, she spoke on the 7th day of every month, and eventually, multiple Pythia served simultaneously to meet the demand of those who sought divine guidance. Before speaking, she prepared through rituals whose details remain uncertain. She bathed in the Castalian spring, whose waters were believed to inspire prophecy. She may have chewed leaves of the laurel, Apollo's sacred tree. She descended into the inner chamber, the Adyton, where no pilgrim was permitted to follow, where she took her seat on the tripod that stood above the cleft in the rock from which the pneuma rose. The breath, the spirit, the vapor that carried divine knowledge into mortal minds. What happened next has been debated for millennia. Ancient sources describe her entering a state of ecstasy, speaking in a voice not her own, uttering words that tumbled forth disconnected and strange. The priests who attended her interpreted these utterances, shaped them into the hexameter verses that were delivered to the waiting pilgrims, added perhaps their own political wisdom to the divine foundation. The prophecies that emerged were famous for their ambiguity, their multiple possible meanings that would only become clear after events had unfolded, their tendency to be true regardless of how circumstances developed. King Croesus of Lydia, the wealthiest monarch of his age, asked whether he should make war against Persia. The oracle replied that if he crossed the Halys River, a great empire would fall. Confident, he attacked, and a great empire did fall. His own. The prophecy was true, but the truth was not what he had assumed. This pattern repeated throughout the oracle's history. The words were accurate, but the meaning was veiled, requiring not just listening, but understanding, not just hearing, but wisdom. Modern science has offered explanations that neither confirm nor deny the sacred nature of what occurred. Geological surveys have identified fault lines beneath the temple site, fissures through which gases might have risen. Ethylene, perhaps, which in small doses creates a state of euphoria and dissociation that might account for the Pythia's trance. The sweet smell that ancient sources describe, the sense of presence, the altered consciousness, all might have chemical explanations. But these explanations explain only mechanism, not meaning. The question of whether the gods spoke through chemical vapors is not a question science can answer, because the gods, if they exist, might use any mechanism they choose. What we can say with certainty is that for over 1,000 years, the wisest people of the ancient world believed that truth could be found here, that the journey to Delphi was worth any hardship, that the words spoken by an ordinary woman on a bronze tripod carried weight that could justify wars or prevent them, that could send colonists to found new cities or warn kings of their approaching doom. Philosophers came seeking guidance. Generals came seeking assurance. Ordinary people came seeking answers to questions that had no ordinary answers. Whether to marry, whether to travel, whether the child they carried would live to adulthood. The temple grew wealthy from their offerings. Gold and silver accumulated in the treasuries that lined the sacred way. The reputation of Delphi spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, until no major decision was undertaken without consulting the oracle. Until the Greeks could not imagine a world without this connection to divine wisdom, this place where the boundary between mortal and immortal grew thin enough to cross. And yet the answers that came were never simple. The oracle did not remove uncertainty, but deepened it, did not provide clarity, but demanded interpretation, did not tell pilgrims what to do, but forced them to discover what they truly wanted to do, and then live with the consequences of their choice. In this way, the oracle was less about prediction than about self-knowledge. The inscription, "Know thyself," was not merely decoration, but was the oracle's true message, repeated in every ambiguous prophecy that forced questioners to examine their own assumptions, their own hopes, their own fears. We linger in the sanctuary as evening falls, as the mountain shadows lengthen and the mist returns to wrap the ruins in veils of grey and gold. The Pythia no longer speaks. The tripod is gone, the chasm sealed, the vapours, if they ever rose, no longer rising. But the questions that were asked here have not been answered, will never be finally answered, will continue to be asked as long as humans face decisions whose outcomes they cannot know. As long as we seek guidance from sources beyond our own limited understanding. As long as we wonder whether the universe is merely mechanism, or whether something, someone, listens when we pray. The chapter closes in the silence that now fills the sanctuary. A silence that feels less like absence than like presence withdrawn. Like a conversation that has not ended, but merely paused, waiting for those with courage enough to listen, patience enough to interpret, wisdom enough to understand that the greatest oracle of all speaks not in words but in the questions. We are brave enough to ask ourselves in the quietest hours of the night. When sleep approaches and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin as the veil between Delphi's mortal pilgrims and the god who once, perhaps, spoke through vapors rising from the breathing earth, beneath the palace of Knossos, where Minoan kings once ruled in splendor that even Homer called magnificent, where frescoes depicted dolphins leaping through painted seas and youths vaulting over sacred bulls, there existed, or was imagined to exist, a structure that gave humanity its deepest architectural nightmare. The labyrinth, passages turning back upon themselves, corridors promising exit only to deliver deeper confusion. A maze so perfect that even its creator nearly failed to find his way out. We descend into this myth as one descends into dream, following the thread of story through darkness that has never quite lifted, understanding why the Greeks feared not death itself, but the endless wandering that might precede it. The labyrinth was built, according to myth, by Daedalus, the greatest craftsman of the ancient world, whose hands could shape anything from bronze or stone or wax and feather. King Minos of Crete had summoned him to solve an unsolvable problem. What to do with the Minotaur, the monstrous child of Minos' wife Pasiphae, and the divine bull, a creature half human and half beast that could not be killed but could not be allowed to roam free. Daedalus designed a prison from which escape was impossible. Corridors that wound and doubled back. Passages that seemed to lead somewhere, but led only to more passages. A structure that tends to use space itself as chains stronger than any metal. The Minotaur was placed at the labyrinth's heart. Not hunting, the myths suggest, but simply waiting, existing in the darkness that was the only home it had ever known. Every 9 years, Athens sent tribute, 7 young men and 7 young women, payment for a war lost long ago. Sacrifices who entered the labyrinth's mouth and never returned to sunlight. The Athenians mourned these losses as other cities mourned plagues, as inevitable suffering that could not be prevented, only endured. The hero Theseus changed the pattern. Son of the Athenian king, he volunteered to be among the 14, not from resignation, but from determination to end the tribute forever. He sailed to Crete with the other victims, his ship carrying black sails that would be changed to white if he returned victorious, a signal that would become crucial in ways he could not foresee. Upon arrival, he encountered Ariadne, daughter of Minos, and between them sparked a love that would prove both salvation and tragedy. Ariadne gave Theseus 2 gifts. The first was a sword, sharp enough to pierce the Minotaur's hide. The second was simpler and more profound, a ball of thread. She instructed him to tie one end at the labyrinth's entrance and unwind it as he walked, creating a line that would guide him back regardless of how many turns he took, how deeply he descended, how completely the maze tried to swallow his sense of direction. The thread was not magic. It was love made physical, trust given tangible form. The promise that someone above ground remembered him and wanted him to return. Theseus entered the darkness. The myths do not describe his journey in detail. Perhaps because the experience of being lost cannot be narrated, can only be felt. The mounting panic when every direction looks identical. The desperation when passages that seemed new proved to be passages already walked. The gradual surrender of hope that is the labyrinth's true weapon. He unwound the thread as he walked, feeling it grow lighter in his hand, trusting that it would hold, that Ariadne would not release her end, that the connection between them would survive whatever waited in the darkness ahead. He found the Minotaur eventually, or the Minotaur found him. The creature has been imagined in countless ways. Savage beast, tragic prisoner, divine punishment made flesh. What is certain is that Theseus killed it, ending the existence of a being that had never asked to be born, that had never chosen its monstrous form, that had known nothing but darkness and the screams of those it killed, because killing was the only language it had been taught. The hero's victory was also a mercy, though the myths rarely frame it that way. Then came the return, and this is where the labyrinth revealed its deepest lesson. Theseus followed the thread, retracing steps that would have been impossible to retrace without that slender guide. The maze that had seemed infinite now yielded its secrets, passage by passage, turn by turn. The way out existing all along, though invisible, without the thread's testimony. He emerged into sunlight, into Ariadne's arms, into the triumph that should have been uncomplicatedly joyful. But the story did not end in joy. Theseus sailed away with Ariadne, but abandoned her on the island of Naxos. Why, the myths disagree. Some say the god Dionysus demanded her for himself. Some say Theseus simply forgot her, his heroic nature not including constancy in love. She who had saved him was left weeping on a foreign shore. Her thread returned to her in the cruelest way. She had given him the means to escape the labyrinth, only to discover that his heart was a labyrinth she could not navigate, a maze where her love was lost forever. And Theseus, sailing home, forgot to change the sails from black to white. His father Aegeus, watching from the cliffs of Athens, saw the black sails approaching and believed his son was dead. In his grief, he threw himself into the sea that would forever bear his name. The Aegean, waters haunted by a father's despair, by a hero's forgetfulness, by the consequences that pursue us even after victory. Theseus arrived home to kingship, but kingship shadowed by the death his carelessness had caused. The archaeological ruins of Knossos reveal a palace of such complexity that modern visitors still lose their bearings among its reconstructed rooms, still understand why the ancients imagined something darker dwelling in its depths. The corridors turn unexpectedly. Rooms open onto rooms. Staircases lead up and down in patterns that resist easy mapping. Whether a true labyrinth ever existed beneath these floors, we cannot know. But the myth endures because the labyrinth exists in every human mind. The fear of being lost, the passages of thought that lead nowhere, the monsters we lock away in darkness because we cannot bear to look at them in light. We remain in these turning passages as sleep approaches, understanding that the labyrinth was never merely architecture, but was metaphor made stone. The thread Ariadne offered was love, but it was also memory, also hope, also the simple faith that someone waits above who wants us to return. Without such thread, we wander forever. With it, even the most complex darkness can be navigated, not avoided, not conquered, but walked through, emerged from, survived. The Minotaur is dead, but the labyrinth remains, in dreams, in the twisting corridors of anxiety, in the mazes we build between ourselves and the truth we fear to face. The chapter closes in the darkness at the maze's heart, where something waits that we must eventually confront, where the thread grows heavy in our hand, where the only way out is forward, always forward, trusting that the thread will hold, that love will guide us home, that even the most complete confusion contains somewhere within it the path to freedom. Rising above the plains of Thessaly, taller than any other peak in Greece, shrouded in clouds that the ancients believed were veils drawn by divine hands to shield immortal splendor from a mortal sight. Mount Olympus held the palaces of the gods, Zeus in his thunder-bright hall, Hera in her gardens where peacocks spread their starry tails, Apollo with his golden lyre whose music could move the very foundations of the world. We ascend slowly through the gathering dusk, following paths that shepherds knew, paths that sometimes vanished into fog, so thick it seemed the mountain itself was breathing, alive, aware of those who dared approach its sacred heights. The Greeks never climbed to the summit. This restraint was not from inability. The peak, while challenging, is not technically difficult to reach. The restraint came from reverence, from understanding that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed, some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries, and the home of the gods was precisely such a place. To climb Olympus would be not achievement, but transgression. Not exploration, but invasion of spaces that did not belong to human feet, human eyes, human curiosity. They imagined the summit bathed in eternal light, radiant beyond the storms that raged on the lower slopes, warmed by a sun that never set, because it was not the ordinary sun, but divine illumination that recognized no schedule, no seasons, no night. The palaces there were built of clouds and light and materials that had no mortal names. Rooms where ambrosia was served on dishes of imperishable gold, where nectar flowed in rivers that fed immortal appetites, where the gods gathered to feast and argue and watch the struggles of humanity far below with interest that ranged from compassionate to cruel. Zeus ruled this realm, father of gods and men, whose weapon was the thunderbolt, and whose symbol was the eagle soaring above all other creatures. He had won his throne through war against his own father, Cronus, who had swallowed his children whole to prevent prophecy from being fulfilled. The prophecy that his son would overthrow him as he had overthrown his own father before. The cosmos was built on violence, on generation rising against generation, on power seized and power defended. And even Zeus knew that his reign would not last forever, that somewhere in the future, a force waited that would end even divine supremacy. Around him gathered the 12 Olympians, each with their own domain, their own character, their own complicated relationships with one another and with the mortals who worship them. Hera, Zeus's wife and sister, goddess of marriage and family, watched her husband's countless infidelities with rage that found expression in punishing not Zeus, but the women and children he pursued and produced. Athena, born from Zeus's head fully armed, was wisdom and warfare combined, patron of crafts and strategy, protector of heroes who approached their challenge with intelligence rather than mere strength. Aphrodite embodied beauty and desire, forces that even the other gods could not resist, powers that launched wars and destroyed kingdoms and made fools of the wise. Poseidon ruled the seas from a palace beneath the waves, his trident capable of raising storms or calming them, his mood as changeable as the waters he commanded. Hades, though technically an Olympian, preferred his underground kingdom, the realm of the dead where all mortals eventually arrive regardless of how they had lived, where the shades drifted in perpetual twilight that was neither punishment nor reward, but simply continuance without life's intensity. Apollo and Artemis, twins born of Zeus and the Titan Leto, governed sun and moon, healing and hunting, poetry and wildness, complementary opposites whose temples often stood near each other, acknowledging that light needed darkness to define it. The gods were not unified. They quarreled and competed, took sides in mortal conflicts for reasons that ranged from ancient grudges to recent slights to simple boredom with immortal existence. During the Trojan War, the Olympians divided, some supporting the Greeks, others the Trojans. Their interventions sometimes decisive and sometimes frustrated by other gods' counter-interventions. The cosmic level of the conflict made every battle fought by mortals also a battle fought by immortals. Every death below echoed by argument above. The war lasting 10 years, partly because the gods themselves could not agree on its outcome. Yet they were still gods, still worthy of worship, still capable of gifts and graces that transformed human lives. Apollo gave music and prophecy. Demeter gave grain and the knowledge of agriculture. Dionysus gave wine and the ecstasy that wine enabled. Athena gave the olive tree to Athens, the domesticated horse to humanity, the strategies by which the weak could overcome the strong. The gods were not good in the sense that modern religions demand goodness of their deities. They were powerful, were real, were forces that had to be respected whether or not they deserved respect. Were the shapes that Greek consciousness gave to energies that could not be denied. The mountain still stands, still gathers clouds around its peaks, still holds silence that feels older than human memory, older than the myths themselves, older perhaps than the idea of gods in any form. Climbers now reach the summit regularly, finding not palaces but bare rock, not nectar but thin air, not divine presence but the particular emptiness that comes from reaching a place that was never meant to be reached, that was holy precisely because it was unreachable, whose sacredness depended on distance that has now been collapsed. We rest on the lower slopes as night approaches, looking upward into the mist, that the Greek believed concealed glory too bright for mortal sight. The gods are gone, or perhaps were never there in the form imagination painted them. But something remains, the sense that heights exist beyond human scaling, that mysteries persist beyond human solving, that the universe contains levels and dimensions that our minds can gesture toward, but never fully comprehend. Olympus was always less about geography than about psychology. The recognition that humanity is not the highest thing, that powers exist that dwarf our understanding, that wisdom begins with acknowledging how small we are beneath a sky that stretches forever. The chapter closes in the gathering darkness, the mountain invisible now, except as a greater darkness against the stars, a shadow that blocks the familiar constellations and forces the eye to recognize. Something is there, something larger than vision can contain, something that the ancients wisely chose not to approach too closely, understanding that some distances are meant to be maintained. Some veils are meant to remain drawn. Some mysteries are not problems to be solved, but truths to be honored in their permanent incompleteness. In a land where deserts met ancient cities, where astronomy was born in the counting of stars, where mathematics flowered into forms so elegant they seemed like prayers written in numbers, there ruled a sultan who feared words more than swords, syllables more than soldiers, the power of speech more than the power of any army that might march against his borders. His fear began, as many terrible things do, with prophecy. In the marketplace, on an ordinary day that carried no warning of what it would become, a poet stood before a small crowd and spoke 3 lines of verse. The words were simple, unadorned, delivered in a voice that carried neither threat nor triumph. But they predicted, with specificity that chilled the Sultan's blood when his spies reported them, the manner and moment of his fall. From that day forward, he declared war on language itself. Poets vanished in the night, pulled from their beds by guards, who came silently, who left no trace of the removal, except empty spaces at breakfast tables and questions that died on tongues that had learned fear speaks louder than curiosity. The poets were not killed. Death creates martyrs, and martyrs create stories, and stories are made of words. Instead, they were taken to places far from the capital, to desert outposts and mountain villages where their words would reach no ears that mattered, where their verses would be spoken only to sand and stone, and the wind that carried nothing back to the city. Libraries burned, their smoke carrying centuries of wisdom into a sky that wept no rain to quench the flames. The Sultan's soldiers came with torches and oil, working systematically through the great repositories of knowledge that had made the city famous across the known world. They burned scrolls written by scholars whose names had become synonyms for wisdom. They burned astronomical charts that mapped the heavens with precision unmatched in any other civilization. They burned medical texts, philosophical treatises, histories, poetry, mathematics, everything reduced to ash that fell on the city like black snow, coating streets and rooftops with the residue of destroyed knowledge. The scholars watched, helpless, as their life's work transformed into smoke. Some wept openly, beyond caring what consequences their tears might bring. Others stood silent, their faces frozen in expressions of grief so profound it seemed to age them decades in the hours it took for the fires to burn themselves out. A few tried to rush into the flames, to save what they could or die trying. But the guards held them back with spears that drew blood without quite delivering death, making them bear witness to the destruction they could not prevent. Schools closed their doors, their courtyards growing wild with weeds that knew no teacher's gentle correction. The buildings remained standing, empty monuments to a function they no longer served. In the schoolyards where children had once played games that taught them mathematics through movement, that instilled logic through riddles, that made learning feel like discovery rather than labor, silence settled heavy as dust. The teaching stones where masters had sat cross-legged while students gathered around, the fountains where discussions continued through hot afternoons, the walls where notable insights had been carved for future students to contemplate, all stood unused, slowly crumbling under the neglect that follows when purpose is removed, but structure remains. The Sultan's guards patrolled with ears trained to catch whispers, eyes sharp for the movement of lips in prayer or protest. The punishment for unauthorized speech was swift, the tongue taken, the voice silenced permanently. The operation was performed by the surgeons skilled enough to ensure survival, cruel enough to ensure the message was received by every witness forced to watch. Those who lost their tongues were released back into the city, living reminders of what speech could cost, their still continuing presence more effective than any proclamation at enforcing the Sultan's will. Markets that once rang with haggling and laughter became theatres of gesture, hands moving in desperate pantomime, faces speaking what mouths no longer could. The merchants developed an elaborate system of signs, fingers indicating quantities, hand positions suggesting qualities, facial expressions negotiating prices. The system worked, after a fashion, allowing commerce to continue. But something essential was lost in the translation from speech to gesture. Some human warmth that comes from voice and hearing, from the back and forth of conversation that is more than just exchange of information, but a kind of communion, a recognition of shared humanity that cannot quite be captured in silent signs. The city learned a new language, of glances, of subtle touches, of silence heavy with all the words that suffocated unspoken. Lovers developed ways of communicating affection through the pressure of held hands, through patterns traced on skin, through looks that carried whole conversations in the space between heartbeats. Parents taught children through demonstration, through patient repetition, through a tenderness that had to work harder to cross the gap that words once bridged effortlessly. Friends met in silence that felt simultaneously sacred and suffocating, treasuring the connection while mourning the ease that had been stolen from it. He surrounded himself with mutes, believing their inability to speak made them loyal. His palace became a tomb of living silence, corridors where footsteps echoed, but voices never rose. The mutes who served him had been chosen carefully, some born without speech, others who had lost it to illness or accident, all of them people whose silence predated his decree and therefore carried no political meaning, no act of resistance or compliance, merely existence in a state the Sultan found comfortable. These servants moved through the palace like ghosts, performing their duties with an efficiency that came from necessity. They could not call out questions or requests, could not coordinate through speech, had to develop instead a wordless cooperation that functioned through mutual understanding built over years of working in silence together. They anticipated needs, responded to the Sultan's gestures, maintained the vast palace without ever disturbing the quiet that he demanded, and they had no choice but to provide. He took no wife, fearing the intimacy of shared words. Marriage proposals came from neighboring kingdoms, from noble families within his own realm, each offering daughters described in letters he burned without reading fully. The very act of courtship required conversation, required the sharing of thoughts and hopes and förspseeds that builds the foundation of partnership. But the Sultan could not imagine sharing his inner world through words, could not imagine trusting another person with the vulnerability that language requires, could not imagine lying beside someone in darkness and speaking of dreams and doubts and all the things that whisper in the mind in hours too small for gods to monitor. He fathered no children, terrified they might speak the prophecy into being. The continuation of his line, normally a sultan's primary duty, became impossible when weighed against his fear. Children speak. It is their nature, their way of learning, of connecting, of becoming human in the fullest sense. To have a child would be to share his palace with someone whose silence could not be guaranteed, whose words might accidentally or intentionally fulfill the prophecy that haunted him. So his line would end with him, the throne passing to a nephew or cousin, whose own relationship with silence was yet to be determined. His court moved like shadows, communicating through written notes that were immediately burned. Ashes scattered so thoroughly that not even ghosts could read what had been written. The notes were brief by necessity. Writing required materials, required time, required a record that, however temporarily existed of communication that happened. So messages were reduced to their essence, stripped of pleasantries and elaboration, becoming mere packets of information passed silently from hand to hand, before being committed to flames that ensured no archaeologist would ever piece together what had been said in the Sultan's silent reign. Yet in the hidden quarters of the city, in cellars and forgotten rooms whose existence the Sultan's maps did not acknowledge, the people preserved their stories. The resistance to silence took forms that adapted to the oppression it resisted. In places where guards did not venture, where the Sultan's attention never reached, the old ways persisted in modified forms, waiting for a day when they might emerge again into light. Grandmothers taught grandchildren the old tales through song hummed so softly it seemed like breathing. The humming carried no words, technically violated no decree, but the melodies were traditional, associated with specific stories that everyone who heard them knew. The tune for the creation myth, the melody for the hero's journey, the rhythm for the love story that ended in tragedy. Each one a carrier of narrative that needed no words because the melody itself was the story. The notes arranged in patterns that suggested plot points and character arcs and moral lessons that had been embedded in the music generations ago, when no one imagined a time when singing the words might be forbidden. Poets composed verses in their minds, memorizing each line without ever giving it sound, creating libraries of the unspoken. These internal compositions grew elaborate over years of refinement, each poet carrying entire volumes in memory, revising and perfecting without ever writing down or speaking aloud the words that consumed their thoughts. The discipline required was extraordinary. To compose without external record, to edit without written draft, to preserve without physical copy. But necessity made poets of the people, made memory their page, made silence their publisher. They passed down the prophecy too, not the 3 lines the Sultan feared, but a 4th line that had never been written, that existed only in collective memory, a line added by the people themselves as commentary on the Sultan's reaction to the first 3 lines. The 4th line said, "Silence broken becomes thunder." It was taught from grandmother to grandchild, from master to apprentice in trades that still required some instruction, from friend to friend in moments of trust, deep enough to risk the sharing. The line became a promise, a assertion that the silence could not last forever, that speech suppressed would eventually erupt with a force proportional to the pressure that had contained it. Thunder is not gentle. It shakes walls, rattles windows, announces storms that transform landscapes. The 4th line suggested that when the Sultan's silence finally broke, the breaking would be loud enough to compensate for all the years of enforced quiet, powerful enough to wash away the structures built on the suppression of human voice. They waited, these keepers of forbidden words, for the day when voices would again rise like dawn after the longest night. They waited with the patience of stones that no water will eventually wear them down, with the persistence of roots that crack foundations over decades of slow growth, with the certainty that silence, however long it lasts, is not humanity's natural state, that people are meant to speak and sing and argue and laugh and cry out and whisper secrets and shout joy and murmur comfort and all the 1,000 ways that voice connects us to each other and to ourselves. The Sultan grew old in his silence, his ears becoming so attuned to quiet that the smallest sound, a footstep in a distant corridor, a door closing rooms away, would startle him awake from sleep that grew ever lighter, ever more fragile. His paranoia deepened with age, his conviction that the prophecy lurked in every potential syllable, making him withdraw further into isolation. Surrounding himself with fewer and fewer people, trusting less and less until finally he trusted no one. Lived alone, attended only by mutes, whose loyalty was assumed rather than earned, whose silence was enforced by nature rather than choice. When he died, his mouth was open, as if death had caught him in the act of speaking or screaming, as if whatever final words he might have had were stolen by the end before they could emerge. His body was found by a mute servant who could not cry out, could only run silently to summon others who came and stood around the body in silence that was simultaneously respectful and resentful, mourning not the man but the end of the fear he had embodied. The funeral was conducted in silence, as he would have wanted. No prayers were spoken aloud, no eulogies delivered, no weeping that involved sound. He was buried in a tomb sealed with words carved into stone. The ultimate irony, that language would mark his resting place, that his name and titles and dates would be preserved in the very medium he had tried to destroy. And then, slowly, sound returned to the city. Not all at once. The fear was too deep, too ingrained for immediate reversal. But gradually, whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became conversation. Conversation became song. The libraries were rebuilt from memories and from copies that had been hidden or smuggled out before the burning. The schools reopened. The markets filled again with voices haggling and laughing and telling stories. The prophecy was never fulfilled in the way the Sultan had feared. His fall came not from the speaking of 3 specific lines, but from the attempt to silence them. From the recognition that a ruler who wars against language wars against humanity itself. From the understanding that words are not the enemy of power, but the foundation of any power worth having. That silence imposed is violence. That voices suppressed will eventually find a way to speak. And when they do, when silence breaks, the sound is indeed like thunder, ancient, powerful, unstoppable, clearing the air for the rain that will make green things grow again in soil that has been too long dry, too long denied the nourishment that falls from sky and speech alike, when both are finally free, on an island where mist never fully lifted, where the boundary between land and sea seemed negotiable with each tide, where the very ground felt temporary beneath your feet, as if it might dissolve back into ocean at any moment. There ruled a prince who never truly claimed his throne. He inherited a kingdom in chaos, a realm that had been prosperous once, but whose prosperity had been consumed by his father's wars. The old king had been ambitious, aggressive, convinced that expansion was the same as success, that each conquered territory added to his glory even as it subtracted from his treasury, from his people's well-being, from the foundation of stability that any kingdom requires to flourish. The prince had watched his father's wars from the palace windows, had seen the soldiers march out with banners flying and weapons shining, had waited for their return with numbers diminished and eyes haunted. He had walked through halls where ministers argued about strategies and supplies, where maps were marked with territories won and lost, where the language was always of glory and victory, even when the reports detailed suffering and defeat. When his father died, not in battle, but in his bed, worn out by the effort of maintaining wars that had outlasted their purpose, the prince inherited not just a throne, but a catastrophe. Enemies at every border, some newly made by his father's aggression, others old rivals who saw the transition of power as opportunity for revenge or reclamation. Treasuries depleted, the gold spent on weapons and soldiers, and the infrastructure of warfare rather than the infrastructure of peace. A people exhausted, mourning their dead, questioning whether the territories won had been worth the sons lost in winning them. It was too much. The weight of it pressed down on the prince like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe, to think, to imagine any action that might make things better rather than worse. So he did what seemed at the time like a reasonable solution to an impossible problem. He fled. Not physically, that would have been abandonment, would have sparked immediate crisis, would have made obvious what he preferred to keep hidden. Instead, he fled into fantasy, into a constructed world where the kingdom's problems could be observed without being felt, witnessed without being experienced, acknowledged without being addressed. He hired actors to perform courtly duties while he wandered disguised through his own streets, watching his kingdom crumble as though observing a play that did not concern him. The actors were professionals, skilled at their craft, capable of portraying the roles they were given with conviction that fooled all but the most careful observers. They dressed in the robes of ministers, studied the mannerisms of power, learned to move through the palace as if they belonged there, as if the authority they projected was real rather than performed. The principal actor, the one who portrayed the prince in official ceremonies, bore enough physical resemblance to make the deception plausible at a distance. With the right lighting, the right clothing, the right positioning that kept observers at a remove, he could pass. He sat on the throne during audiences, though he granted no actual decisions. He appeared at ceremonies, though he authorized nothing that would commit the kingdom to any particular course. He was, in essence, a placeholder, a symbol without substance, a crown worn by someone who had no right to its weight, but who carried it convincingly enough that most people never questioned whether the person beneath it was who they assumed. The other actors filled out the court, creating a complete tableau of governance. They sat in council chambers, debating policies that would never be enacted, signing decrees that held no authority. They discussed the kingdom's problems with appropriate graffiti, proposed solutions with suitable earnestness, created elaborate plans that looked official when written on parchment, sealed with wax that bore the royal Seoul seal, a seal the prince had given them, along with his authority to use it for purposes that were purely theatrical. Meanwhile, the true business of state, the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, the defense of borders, dissolved into neglect. The structures of government continued to operate at lower levels. The mechanisms that had been established by previous rulers who took their duties seriously. But without direction from above, without coordination, without the authority to make decisions that required the prince's approval, the government became increasingly ineffective, increasingly unable to respond to problems that required unified action or difficult choices. Villagers appealed for help against bandits and received eloquent letters written by playwrights, beautiful compositions that expressed sympathy and promised action, but committed to nothing specific, authorized no troops, allocated no resource, simply acknowledged the problem in language so polished it almost disguised the fact that it offered no actual assistance. The letters were signed with the prince's signature, forged by the lead actor who had practiced until he could replicate it perfectly, and sealed with the royal seal, giving them every appearance of official authority while containing no substance behind that appearance. Cities requested grain during famine and received poems describing abundant harvests that existed only in imagination. The poems were genuinely beautiful. The playwrights the prince had hired were talented, capable of creating verses that painted pictures of granaries overflowing, of fields golden with wheat, of bread so plentiful it could be shared freely with anyone who hungered. The poems described a kingdom that existed nowhere except in the lyrical language that conjured it, a realm of plenty that mocked the reality of scarcity it was sent to address. The prince himself walked among his people wearing the clothes of a merchant, a fisherman, a beggar. He had different costumes for different districts, different personas for different audiences, different names that he gave when asked, though he often chose to say nothing, to let people assume whatever they would about the stranger who appeared and disappeared without explanation. He listened to his people's complaints about their ruler, stood in taverns while men drunk enough to forget caution spoke freely about the prince's uselessness, his absence, his failure to address the problems that grew more urgent with each season that passed without action. The prince nodded sympathetically, agreed that yes, the prince was indeed neglectful, absent, lost in whatever concerns occupied him while his people suffered. Sometimes, caught in the moment, he added his own criticisms, elaborating on the prince's failings with an insider's knowledge that made his condemnation particularly cutting. Sometimes he wept at their suffering. Late at night, alone in whatever room he had rented, under whatever false name he was using, he would lie awake thinking of the stories he had heard. The children going hungry, the elderly being robbed by bandits who faced no consequence, the merchants struggling under taxes that went uncollected in some districts while being harshly enforced in others, creating an arbitrary unfairness that bred resentment and division. The tears were real. The sorrow was genuine. The wish that things could be different, that he could somehow make them better, was sincere. But sincerity without action is indulgence. Emotion without responsibility is performance. And the prince performed his own suffering as thoroughly as the actors in his palace performed governance, with the key difference being that his performance had no audience but himself, no purpose but the temporary relief of allowing feeling without the burden of doing. Sometimes he bought people drinks and listened to their stories deep into the night, hearing about their lives with an attention that would have served him well if he had applied it to actual governance, if he had taken what he learned in these midnight conversations and transformed it into policy, into action, into the work of ruling that he had hired others to pretend to do, while he pretended to be someone other than himself. But always, come morning, he returned to his palace, removed his disguise, and became again the prince who could not bear the weight of the crown he wore only in private. In mirrors that reflected a truth he visited, but never inhabited. The transition from commoner costume to royal robes felt like shedding one skin for another, each one somehow false. Each one a performance of an identity he never quite managed to fully occupy. The kingdom learned to govern itself, village by village, forming councils of necessity. In the absence of effective central authority, local structures emerged to fill the void. Village elders who had once deferred to the prince's ministers found themselves making decisions that affected their community's survival. Merchants who had once waited for royal charters created their own agreements about trade and fair dealing. Farmers who had once looked to the crown for protection from bandits hired their own guards, pooling resources to create security that the state no longer provided. They created laws in the absence of royal decree, settled disputes through elder wisdom rather than courtly judgment, organized defense when no army came to their aid. The laws were simpler than the formal codes that had existed before, more directly connected to the problems they addressed, more flexible in their application because they was created by people who understood context, who knew the individuals involved, who could craft solutions that fit circumstances rather than applying rigid rules that might not account for nuance. They became, inadvertently, free, though they still paid taxes to a throne that gave nothing in return. The taxes were collected by functionaries who operated on precedent and habit, who continued to gather revenue because that was the system that existed, that had existed for generations, that no one had explicitly ordered to stop even though no one was actively directing it to continue. The money flowed into treasuries where it sat unused, accumulating while the kingdom it was meant to serve struggled to meet needs that gold could address if anyone with authority to spend it cared enough to do so. They still bowed to a crown that had become purely ornamental, a relic of a contract broken by the very man who should have honored it. When the actor who played the prince appeared at ceremonies, the people bowed because that was custom, because open resistance would bring consequences they couldn't afford, because it was easier to maintain the fiction than to confront the reality that their prince had abdicated everything but the title, had kept the crown while abandoning the responsibility that gave it meaning. And the prince wandered on, a ghost haunting his own reign, present and absent, ruler and refugee from his own responsibility. Years passed. The actors aged, had to be replaced with new performers who learned the roles from their predecessors. The prince himself aged, his disguises requiring more effort as his face became known, despite his attempts to remain unknown, as his distinctive way of moving or speaking betrayed him to observers more perceptive than he credited. He told himself he was learning, that his time among the people was valuable, that he was gathering understanding that would someday inform better governance. But someday never came. The knowledge accumulated without application. The understanding deepened without transformation into action. The experience enriched him personally while doing nothing for the people whose suffering had provided it. The kingdom survived despite him rather than because of him. Resilience rooted not in royal leadership, but in the basic human capacity to adapt, to organize, to create order from chaos when necessity demands it. The people who had learned to govern themselves did so with increasing competence, developing systems that worked better in some way than the centralized authority that had failed them. Discovering that solutions crafted locally by people who understood local problems often fit better than edicts issued from distant palaces by rulers who saw their subjects as abstract concerns rather than specific individuals. When the prince eventually died, not young, having lived a long life of observation without participation, the transition of power barely registered. The actor who had been playing him was retired with a pension. A cousin was crowned in a ceremony attended by people who bowed out of habit more than conviction. The new ruler found a kingdom that had learned to function without effective central authority, a realm that had adapted to neglect by developing self-sufficiency, a people who had discovered they could survive without the protection they had once believed only a king could provide. And in the records, in the official histories written by chroniclers who were themselves part of the apparatus of pretend governance, the prince was remembered as a mysterious figure, a ruler who moved among his people in disguise, who understood them as few kings ever had. The history made his evasion sound like wisdom, his absence like presence by other means, his failure to lead like a different kind of leadership, more subtle, more in touch with the common experience. But the people remembered differently. They remembered a prince who cared enough to cry, but not enough to act, who felt their pain but would not bear the burden of alleviating it, who knew their problems intimately but refused to use his power to address them. They remembered, and they taught their children, preserving a truth more accurate than the official history, that empathy without action is indulgence, that understanding without application is cowardice, that a crown unworn might as well not exist, that a throne unoccupied becomes a symbol of absence rather than authority, that a prince who could not bear the weight of responsibility should have set down the crown rather than keeping it while fleeing everything it demanded of him. In a realm where cherry blossoms marked the passage of seasons, where calligraphy transformed thought into sacred art, where every gesture carried weight, the unending accumulated over centuries of refinement, there ruled an empress who could not accept the truth written in every falling petal, that beauty fades, that youth departs, that time shows mercy to no throne, no matter how elevated or adorned. She had been beautiful once, genuinely, extraordinarily beautiful in ways that inspired poets and painters, that made ordinary conversation pause when she entered rooms, that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection of proportion and grace. Her beauty had been noted from childhood, praised and cultivated, transformed into her primary identity, the quality that defined her above intelligence or kindness or strength or any other attribute a person might possess. When she ascended to the throne, through complicated succession politics that involved the death of brothers and the strategic marriage and divorce of a father who cycled through wives seeking male heirs, her beauty became part of the imperial mystique, proof of heaven's favor, evidence that she was meant to rule. portraits commissioned during her early reign show a woman of such remarkable appearance that even accounting for artistic flattery, something exceptional must have existed beneath the paint. But time, that great democrat, grants beauty to no one permanently. The Empress was perhaps 30 when she first noticed the subtle changes. A line at the corner of her eye that had not been there the season before. A quality to her skin that seemed fractionally less luminous. A tone to her reflection that suggested the beginning of what would become, if left to natural course, the ordinary aging that every human body undergoes. For most people, these changes arrive gradually enough to accommodate, to integrate into identity, to accept as part of the journey from youth to maturity to age. But the Empress's entire sense of self, her understanding of her value, her belief in her right to rule, all of it was tangled inseparably with her appearance, with the beauty that had defined her since before she could remember being anything else. So she could not accept it, would not accept it. Instead, she gathered alchemists from across the known world, promising them fortunes for formulas to halt the sun's advance across her skin, to freeze the mirror's reflection at the moment of her perfection. The alchemists came from distant lands, bringing with them knowledge accumulated over lifetimes of study. They came from desert kingdoms, where preservation of the dead had been perfected to the point that bodies could remain unchanged for millennia. They came from mountain monasteries, where monks had dedicated centuries to understanding the relationship between body and spirit, seeking ways to purify the flesh or transcend its limitations. They came from island nations where rare plants grew that were said to extend life, to heal wounds, to restore vitality to the aged. They set up laboratories in palace wings, filling rooms with apparatus and ingredients, with bubbling retorts and careful measurements, with substances distilled and combined and tested on animals first, then on prisoners who had little choice but to volunteer, then on servants who were promised rewards they would rarely receive. The experiments proceeded with the methodical patience of science applied to an impossible goal, seeking through rational means to achieve what nature had not designed to be achieved. Her quest consumed the empire's wealth, like fire consumes parchment. The alchemists' fees were substantial, paid in gold that represented taxes collected from provinces already struggling. But beyond their fees, the ingredients they required were often rare, exotic, expensive beyond reason. Rare herbs were harvested to extinction, entire species of plants that had taken millennia to evolve were consumed in experiments that sought to extract whatever properties they might possess that could slow or reverse aging. Minerals were mined from sacred mountains until the peaks themselves grew hollow, collapsing into valleys that had once bloomed with life. Mountains that had been revered for generations, that had been considered homes of gods or spirits, were excavated for rare earths, for compounds that existed only in specific geological formations, for crystals that the alchemist believed might hold some essential quality of permanence, some resistance to change that could be transferred to human flesh. She bathed in milk stolen from mothers whose infants cried from hunger. The milk baths were recommended by alchemists who believed that the properties that nourished infants might also preserve skin, might transfer some quality of new life to aging flesh. Servants collected milk from women across the empire, women who were paid for their milk, but whose children suffered from the diversion of nourishment meant for them. The empress bathed in enormous tubs filled with milk that quickly soured in the heat, requiring constant replenishment, consuming daily what could have fed families for weeks. She wore masks of gold dust and crushed pearls, while her subject wore rags thin as spider silk, praying for winters they could survive. The masks were applied each night, compounds mixed fresh by attendants who had been trained in their application, who spread the precious materials across the empress's skin in layers that were meant to nourish, to tighten, to preserve. The gold was real, ground to dust fine enough to pass through silk, mixed with pearl powder created by crushing pearls that could have paid for disaster relief, for food stores, for any of the 1,000 needs that an empire always has, but which went unmet while resources flowed toward preserving the empress's appearance. The palace became a shrine to stillness. Clocks were banned, for they marked time's passage, the ticking a constant reminder of the force she could not stop. The mechanical clocks that had been imported from distant lands, marvels of engineering that kept time with precision unknown to water clocks or sundials, were removed and destroyed. The absence of clocks made time in the palace feel strange, unmoored, with no regular marking of hours, days bleeding into each other in ways that made servants forget how long they had worked, when they had last rested, whether morning had passed to afternoon or afternoon into evening. Mirrors were permitted only after court artists perfected each one's reflection, ensuring flattering light and angles that defied honesty. The mirror makers developed techniques that incorporated subtle distortions into the glass, curves that stretched and flattered, that took years from reflected faces, that showed the empress not as she was, but as she wished to be. The process of creating these mirrors was complex, requiring grinding and polishing to specifications so precise that most mirrors failed inspection and had to be destroyed, their fragments buried where they could not reflect truth that the empress had forbidden to exist in her presence. Her courtiers learned to age in secret, hiding grey hairs beneath elaborate wigs, painting youth onto faces that time had touched. To appear old in her presence was to remind her of the war she could not win, and such reminders often proved fatal to those careless enough to embody them. Not fatal literally, she did not execute courtiers for aging, but fatal to careers, to positions at court, to the access to power and influence that required remaining in the empress's favor. So the court became a strange place where everyone performed youth, regardless of their actual age, where 70-year-old ministers wore makeup and padding to suggest vitality they did not feel, where grey hair was cause for panicked overnight dying, where wrinkles meant banishment, or at least removal from positions that required proximity to the empress. The courtiers became actors in a play about a place that did not age, performing roles in a fantasy that everyone knew was false, but that no one could afford to acknowledge. In the garden she commissioned, Sculptors carved statues of her younger self, each one perfect, unchanging, a lie told in marble and bronze. The garden sprawled across acres that had once grown food. Transformed into a gallery of the Empress at different ages of her youth, each statue capturing her at a specific moment that she deemed worth preserving. Empress at 17, frozen in marble that would outlast memory. Empress at 22, cast in bronze that would corrode over centuries, but slowly enough that generations would see her as she saw herself. Eternally young, eternally beautiful, eternally at the peak of perfection that flesh could achieve. She walked among these frozen versions of herself as decades passed, her reflection fragmenting across a gallery of impossibilities. The walks became ritual, a daily pilgrimage through a landscape that presented her as she wished to be rather than as she was becoming. She would pause before each statue, comparing her actual reflection in the polished surfaces to the idealized version rendered in stone, measuring the distance between reality and preservation, feeling that distance widen with each passing year. Despite all the treatments, all the potions, all the desperate attempts to stop what could not be stopped, the people noticed the statues never changed, while their empress, despite all her arts and potions, grew brittle as autumn leaves. They were not permitted to speak this observation aloud, but they noticed nonetheless. They saw her at ceremonies, at formal appearances, where she sat elevated and distant, but still visible. And they saw what the flattering lights and careful positioning could not fully disguise. That time was winning the war she waged against it. That the treatments and potions were losing their efficacy, or had never had efficacy except in her mind. That the face on the throne grew yearly more distant from the faces frozen in marble throughout the gardens. They noticed and said nothing, for the truth had become the most dangerous contraband in an empire where the greatest crime was acknowledging that even empresses must someday bow to the same force that bends every blade of grass, every star, every stone toward its eventual rest. Servants who cleaned the empress's chambers saw in the morning light what carefully maintained evening illumination concealed. Attendants who dressed her felt beneath silk robes the body that was aging, despite everything money and desperation could do to prevent it. But they maintained the fiction, performed their parts in the collective pretense, because to do otherwise was to risk consequences that went beyond personal punishment, to threatening the entire elaborate structure of denial that the Empress had built around herself. The alchemists, for their part, continued their work with decreasing confidence. The most honest among them knew they were seeking what could not be found, knew that aging was not a disease to be cured, but a process woven into the fabric of organic life, knew that the Empress's quest was doomed by its basic misunderstanding of what humans are and how flesh functions. But they continued because stopping meant admitting failure, meant confessing that they had taken her gold and given her nothing but false hope, meant facing her disappointment, which, even more than her anger, was something they found they could not bear to witness. Some of them began to believe their own fabrications, convincing themselves that the next formula would work where previous ones had failed, that some combination of ingredients not yet tried would unlock the secret that had eluded every generation before them. Others simply learned to lie convincingly, to describe subtle improvements that existed nowhere except in descriptions, to attribute to their potions effects that were indistinguishable from placebo or from the normal variation in how a face appears at different times and in different lights. The empire suffered from the diversion of resources, but not catastrophically. The structure of government was robust enough to function even when the Empress's attention was focused almost entirely on her appearance rather than on administration. Ministers governed, taxes were collected, infrastructure was maintained, all the mechanisms of state continuing to operate largely independent of the person who sat at its nominal center. The empire was wealthy enough that the waste, though substantial, did not immediately cause collapse. But there was opportunity cost. The good that could have been done with resources instead devoted to impossible quests. The schools that could have been built, the roads repaired, the suffering alleviated. All the positive acts that never happened because the gold was spent elsewhere. As she aged, and she did age despite everything, the Empress withdrew. Public appearances became rare, then occasional, then almost mythical. She ruled increasingly through intermediaries, through written decrees that carried her seal, but that might have been written by ministers who had learned to anticipate her wishes, or who simply made policy in her name, knowing she was too absorbed in her private war against time to notice or care. The palace filled with mirrors that lied, and courtiers who performed, and gardens filled with statues that showed what was lost rather than what remained. And at the center of this elaborate construction sat an empress who had become a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in chambers where every surface was controlled to show her only what she wished to see, surrounded by people who dared not speak truth, spending her remaining years fighting a war that could never be won, that was lost from the moment she decided winning was necessary, that transformed what could have been dignified maturity into desperate grasping after something that existed only in memory and marble, preserved everywhere except in the one place it mattered most. In the living flesh that time, patient and inexorable, continued to move through its ordained passage from youth to age to whatever lies beyond, carrying the Empress with it despite her protests, despite her potions, despite her refusal to accept what every human body knows in its bones, that we are temporary, that beauty fades, that fighting this truth only makes its victory more complete when it finally, inevitably, arrives on rocky islands where the sea turned treacherous, where currents deceived even experienced navigators, and reefs lurked beneath surfaces that seemed calm. Creatures waited whose voices could make men forget everything. Home, family, duty, survival itself. Songs so beautiful that sailors threw themselves into the waves simply to move closer to the source, choosing death over the agony of sailing away from such music. We approached the siren's shore with Odysseus, bound to the mast of his ship at his own command. His crew's ears stopped with beeswax, so they could not hear what he had chosen to hear and somehow survive. The sirens were not simply monsters. The myths describe them as part woman and part bird, daughters of a river god and a muse, originally beautiful companions of Persephone, who were transformed after failing to protect her from Hades' abduction. Their singing was inheritance from their divine mother, music so pure, so perfectly aligned with what the soul most deeply wanted, that no mortal could resist its pull. They sat on their islands, surrounded by the bones of those who had listened, the ships rotting on the rocks, the skulls grinning eyeless at the sea that carried more victims toward their deaths. What did they sing? The ancient sources are remarkably specific. The sirens promised knowledge, not pleasure. They claimed to know everything that had happened at Troy, everything that happened everywhere on earth, all the secrets that mortality concealed from human understanding. Their song offered not seduction, but education, or rather, seduction through education, the irresistible promise that listening just a little longer would reveal truths that would make everything worthwhile, that the knowledge was worth any price, including the price of dying to obtain it. Odysseus wanted to hear them, not from death wish, but from curiosity that defined his character. He was the man who always wanted to know, who could not pass a mystery without investigating it, who had sacrificed years of his journey home to experience what others only heard rumors about. So he devised the plan. His crew would be deaf to the singing, protected by the beeswax, able to row past the danger without temptation. But he would listen, bound so tightly to the mast that he could not escape regardless of how desperately he struggled. The ship approached the island. The singing began. Homer does not describe the music itself, perhaps because it cannot be described, perhaps because the song was different for each listener, perhaps because whatever the sirens sang contained truths that could not be safely repeated even in poetry. What Homer describes is Odysseus' response, how he strained against the ropes until they cut into his flesh, how his face showed ecstasy and agony, intermingled until they were indistinguishable, how he commanded his men to release him with gestures they could not hear him speak, how they only tied him tighter as he had instructed them to do before the hearing began. The singing faded as the ship moved on. The island fell behind. The bones remained unjoined by Odysseus' own. He had heard the sirens and survived. One of the only mortals in all of Greek mythology to do so. But what did he learn? The myths never say. Whatever knowledge the sirens offered was his alone, carried silently through the rest of his journey, never shared with his crew, never revealed to wife or son, never recorded for posterity to examine. Perhaps the knowledge was that there was no knowledge, that the promise was the lure, that the sirens offered not truth, but the illusion of truth, that the song was beautiful precisely because it promised what could never be delivered, that those who died swimming toward the island died pursuing something that existed only in the space between desire and despair. Or perhaps the knowledge was real, and Odysseus kept it secret, because some truths cannot be spoken, can only be heard in the moment of their singing, can only be carried in silence by those who survive the hearing. The sirens themselves, according to one tradition, threw themselves into the sea and drowned after Odysseus escaped. Not from grief, but from something like professional failure. Having finally encountered a listener who resisted, whose curiosity was strong but whose will was stronger, who proved that the trap was not inescapable, that the song was not irresistible, that human beings could hear the most beautiful thing in the world and still choose to sail away from it toward home. We sail past their island in the gathering dusk, hearing nothing, understanding that the song was always less about sound than about longing, the human desire to know what cannot be safely known, to hear what cannot be survived hearing, to pursue beauty into the very rocks where it destroys us. The chapter closes in the silence after music, in the emptiness after promise, in the distance that grows between the ship and the island, where something still waits, still sings perhaps to no one, still offers knowledge that may or may not exist to listeners who will never hear it from our protected place in the story, our wax-stopped ears, our ropes that hold us to the mast of ordinary existence, where we survive but never learn what dying to learn might have revealed. In two dialogues written 24 centuries ago, the philosopher Plato described a civilization that has haunted human imagination ever since. Atlantis, the island empire that flourished beyond the pillars of Hercules, that grew mighty and wealthy beyond any kingdom the Greeks knew, that turned from nobility to corruption, that the gods destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the waves to become legend and warning. We descend through Plato's words into this drowned realm, walking streets that were said to gleam with precious metals, entering temples that no living eye has seen, searching for a city that may never have existed except in the mind of a philosopher teaching lessons about pride and fall. Plato placed the story in the mouth of Critias, who claimed to have heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests during a visit to their temples. The priests, Solon was told, kept records going back 9,000 years. Records that showed Greek history to be recent and provincial, mere footnote to ages of civilization that the Greeks had forgotten but the Egyptians preserved. Among these records was the account of Atlantis, a power so great that it had once threatened to conquer the entire Mediterranean, a danger so extreme that only Athens, a different Athens, 9,000 years gone, had managed to resist it. The island lay beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean that bears its name. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, rich in resources that included precious metals, abundant forests, elephants, and a mysterious substance called orichalcum that glowed like fire and was second in value only to gold. The Atlanteans built a capital city arranged in concentric rings of land and water, connected by tunnels and bridges, defended by walls covered in bronze and tin and orichalcum that made the city shimmer like something from divine imagination. The Atlanteans were originally noble, descended from Poseidon himself, who had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Clito and created the island as a home for her. Surrounded by rings of sea and land that no one could cross until he taught his children how. The first king, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the ocean, and his descendants ruled wisely for generations. Their divine blood keeping them virtuous, their isolation keeping them uncorrupted by the weaknesses that plagued lesser civilizations. But divine blood dilutes across generations. The Atlanteans became more mortal than God, more human than divine, and with humanity came the failings that humans cannot escape. Greed, ambition, the desire for more than they had, the willingness to take from others what they could not produce themselves. They conquered the lands around the Mediterranean, subjugating peoples who had done them no harm, preparing to attack Greece itself and establish dominion over the entire known world. This was when the gods intervened. Zeus gathered the Olympians to decide Atlantis' fate. And though Plato's dialogue breaks off before revealing the judgment, the outcome is clear from the narrative frame. The island was destroyed, swallowed by the sea in a cataclysm that erased it so completely that even memory of its existence faded everywhere except in the records of Egyptian priests. The Athenians who had resisted Atlantis were destroyed as well. Their civilization reset to zero, their heroism forgotten, their sacrifice recorded only in foreign archives that would not be read for 9,000 years. Scholars have debated Atlantis ever since Plato wrote. Some believe he invented the entire story as philosophical allegory, a warning about hubris, about the corruption that power brings, about the divine punishment that awaits those who forget their place in the cosmic order. Others have searched for real historical inspirations. The volcanic destruction of Minoan Thera, the flooding of coastal cities during the rise of sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, lost civilizations whose ruins might yet be found beneath waves that cover secrets more thoroughly than any vault. The searches continue. Amateur archaeologists have claimed to find Atlantis in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in the sands of the Sahara that was once a green and fertile land. None have produced evidence that convinces mainstream scholarship. And yet the legend persists. The dream of a lost civilization that knew what we have forgotten, that achieved what we have lost, that sank beneath the waters, carrying wisdom that the modern world desperately needs but cannot recover. We float above the imagined ruins as night gathers, seeing towers that rise toward a surface they will never reach. Gardens where sea creatures swim among statues of forgotten gods. Libraries whose scrolls have dissolved into the salt that preserves nothing, that erases everything, that turns the greatest achievements into sediment, indistinguishable from common sand. The silence here is absolute. The silence of all civilizations that believed themselves eternal until the moment they discovered they were not. That built monuments meant to last forever and watched them crumble in a day. That learned too late that the gods' patience is not infinite. That pride precedes a fall that leaves nothing behind except stories told by those who cannot prove what they describe. The chapter closes in the depths where Atlantis may or may not lie, where truth and myth have merged so completely that separating them would destroy both, where the lesson Plato intended to teach has outlived any interest in whether his teaching used fiction or fact. The city dreamed beneath the waves, the dreaming continues. And we who dream with it learn what Plato wanted us to learn. That power is temporary, that virtue is fragile, that the sea remembers nothing, or perhaps remembers everything, in depths where human memory cannot follow, in silence where even legends eventually drown. He was the greatest musician who ever lived, son of Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, whose playing could make stones weep and rivers pause in their flowing, whose voice could tame wild beasts and bend trees toward him as flowers bend toward the sun. And yet when death took his beloved Eurydice on their wedding day, even Orpheus could not play her back to permanent life, could only follow her to the underworld and lose her again through a love so desperate it could not obey even the simplest command. We follow his descent through the caverns that led from the living world to Hades' realm, hearing the music he played to soften the hearts of the dead. Understanding that some boundaries exist even music cannot cross. Eurydice had died from a snake bite, fleeing through tall grass from a pursuer whose advances she refused. The bite was quick, the venom quicker, and before the wedding feast was finished, she was shade, descending to the underworld to join the countless dead who had gone before. Orpheus's grief was so extreme that the world itself seemed to mourn with him. His songs became laments that made all who heard them weep, that made nature fall silent out of respect for sorrow beyond nature's comprehension. He could not accept her death. This refusal was not denial. He knew she was dead, knew where she had gone, knew that mortals did not return from that place. But knowing and accepting are different things. And Orpheus decided that the laws governing the dead did not apply to him, that his love was exceptional enough to warrant exceptional response, that if he could reach the underworld and play before its rulers, he might persuade them to release what death had claimed. The entrance was at Tanarum, a cave that led downward into darkness that grew more absolute with every step. Orpheus descended without weapon, without companion, carrying only his lyre, the instrument Apollo himself had given him, the gift that contained all the power he possessed. The shades of the dead swirled around him as he walked, drawn to the warmth of the living, to the music that already began to sound as he moved through the darkness. He played as he descended. He played for the ferryman Charon, who stopped his work to listen, who ferried him across the Styx without demanding payment, because the music was payment enough. He played for Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the underworld's gates, whose growling softened into something like a dog's contented sleep as the notes washed over him. He played for the tormented souls in the deepest regions, whose punishments paused while the music lasted. Sisyphus sat on his boulder. Tantalus forgot his thirst. The Danaids stopped carrying water in their leaking jars. He came at last before Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. And there he played and sang the song that would determine everything. He sang of love, not love as pleasant emotion, but love as force that connected all things, that made the universe cohere, that had brought Persephone herself to this underground realm when Hades' desire overcame all obstacles. He sang that he had come not to steal what death had rightly claimed, but to borrow it briefly, to ask for a delayed payment that would eventually be paid in full when his own death brought him to join Eurydice forever. Persephone wept. Even Hades, whose heart was stone, was moved. They granted his request, but with a condition. Eurydice would follow him back to the upper world. But he must not look back at her until they both had emerged into sunlight. If he turned before they reached the surface, she would be lost forever, returned to death with no second appeal possible. He accepted. He began the ascent. Eurydice followed, or so he had to believe, because he could not see her, could not hear her footsteps in the silence of the underworld, could not feel her presence behind him, though he strained every sense trying to perceive what he was forbidden to verify. The path upward was longer than the path down had been. The darkness seemed designed to create doubt. Was she truly there? Had the gods lied? Had he imagined the entire negotiation, hallucinated an agreement that had never been made? He climbed. He did not look back. The light began to grow ahead. The entrance was approaching, the surface world waiting to receive them both. Just a few more steps, just a little more faith, just the ability to trust what could not be confirmed, to believe without seeing, to accept that love does not require constant proof. At the very edge of daylight, when one more step would have brought him fully into the sun, he turned. The myths disagree about why. Some say he feared she was not truly there to her there. Some say he wanted so desperately to see her face that he could not wait one more moment. Some say the gods had designed a test they knew he would fail, that the condition was impossible for love as intense as his, that the loss was determined from the moment the bargain was made. Eurydice was there. For an instant, visible in the half-light at the threshold, her arms reaching toward him, her lips forming his name. Then she faded, pulled backward into the darkness, becoming shadow again, becoming absence again, becoming nothing again except the word that described what she had been, beloved. Gone. Orpheus tried to follow, but Charon would not ferry him twice. This music could not work the same miracle again. He wandered the upper world for years afterward, refusing to love again, refusing comfort, singing songs of loss so profound that eventually those who could not bear his grief tore him apart. Literally, according to the myth, Maenads dismembering him because his sorrow was an insult to the joy that Dionysus demanded. His severed head floated down the river Hebrus, still singing, still calling Eurydice's name, until it reached the island of Lesbos, where it was buried, and where, they said, nightingales sang more sweetly than anywhere else in Greece, as if the music had seeped into the soil and blessed everything that grew there. The chapter closes at the threshold, where Orpheus turned, where love proved too strong to obey rules, and yet not strong enough to break them, where the simplest condition became the impossible condition, because trust is harder than courage, because faith asks more of us than action ever does. He reached the edge of success and failed at the final moment. He was the greatest musician who ever lived, and his music could not save what he loved most. The myth endures because it speaks to every loss that cannot be undone, every chance that cannot be taken again, every backward glance that costs us everything we were reaching toward. The silence after the music ends, the darkness that follows the fading face, the long way back up, alone, in the grove sacred to the hero Academus, just outside Athens' walls, where olive trees cast shadows that moved like thoughts across the grass. Plato established a school that would shape Western civilization for 23 centuries. The Academy, where students walked beneath branches discussing forms and shadows, justice and beauty, the nature of reality itself, and whether human minds could ever truly grasp what lay beyond the flickering images on the cave wall. We enter the garden in the hour when teaching typically occurred, when afternoon light fell golden through leaves that whispered with accumulated wisdom, when the boundary between conversation and revelation grew thin as twilight. Plato had traveled widely before founding his school, to Egypt, to Sicily, to Italy, where he studied with Pythagoreans who believed mathematics was the language of reality. He had watched his teacher Socrates die, executed by the Athenian democracy for the crime of asking too many questions, for teaching the young to think rather than simply accept, for being annoying to those who preferred certainty to the perpetual doubt that philosophy cultivated. The death had convinced Plato that something was wrong with the world as it presented itself, that appearances could not be trusted, that truth, if truth existed, must lie somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The Academy was his response, a place where Mtin could be trained to see beyond appearances, where the gradual ascent from shadow to reality could be undertaken with guides who had traveled the path before, where the beautiful and the good and the true could be pursued without the interference of those who did not understand why such pursuit mattered. The school was not a building, but a community, not a curriculum, but a conversation that continued across decades, across generations, across the boundary between teacher and student, that Plato believed was always temporary, that the student would eventually become teacher, who would have students who would become teachers in turn. He taught that the world we see is illusion, shadows cast on a cave wall by firelight, mistaken for reality by prisoners who have known nothing else, who cannot imagine that the shapes flickering before them are merely distortions of objects they have never seen. The prisoner who is freed, who turns to see the fire, who climbs out of the cave into blinding sunlight. This prisoner experiences philosophy, the journey from darkness to illumination, from comfortable delusion to painful truth. The process hurts. The freed prisoner cannot at first bear the light, cannot see clearly, cannot understand why what he now perceives is more real than what he perceived before. Only gradually, through discipline and persistence, does vision adjust, does reality become visible, does the former prisoner understand how thoroughly he was deceived. The forms were what the ascent revealed, perfect, eternal templates of which all earthly things were imperfect copies. The beautiful thing we see reflects the form of beauty, but is not itself beauty. It can decay, can be destroyed, can cease to exist while beauty itself remains unchanged. The just action participates in the form of justice, but never embodies it completely. Only the form is fully just, only the form is permanent. Philosophers were those who learned to perceive the forms directly, who developed the inner vision that could see beyond appearance to essence, who returned to the cave, for Plato insisted they must return to help other prisoners begin their own ascent. His students questioned, challenged, refined. Among them walked Aristotle, who would eventually establish his own school and reject much of what Plato taught, while honoring the method of questioning that made all subsequent philosophy possible. Aristotle believed the forms were not separate from material things, but were embodied in them, that the essence of a chair was in each actual chair, rather than in some transcendent realm of perfect chairs. The disagreement was fundamental, the conversation unresolved, the argument continuing across millennia through every subsequent philosopher who took sides or tried to synthesize what seemed unsynthesizable. The academy continued for centuries after Plato's death. Some traditions say over 900 years, from 387 BCE until 529 CE, when the Christian emperor Justinian closed the pagan schools. Leadership passed from philosopher to philosopher, the conversation never quite ending, the questions never quite answered. Later generations drifted from Plato's original teachings into mysticism, into skepticism, into combinations with other traditions that Plato himself might not have recognized. But the commitment to seeking truth through conversation, the belief that wisdom could be approached, if not possessed, the understanding that questions were more important than answers, these survived every shift in doctrine, every change in their leadership, every transformation of the Academy's mission. We walk among these seekers as darkness gathers and the first stars emerge, those same stars that Plato believed were divine beings, eternal minds circling in perfect mathematical orbits that demonstrated the orderliness underlying apparent chaos. The philosophers are gone now. The olive trees are gone. The grove is archaeological memory. The conversations have fallen silent, except where they continue in books that have survived, in schools that carry the Academy's name, in every mind that values questions above certainties, that suspects the world presents appearances rather than realities, that wonders about the shadows and guesses that something brighter costs them. The chapter closes in the garden where wisdom was cultivated like crops, where minds were tended like plants, where the slow growth toward understanding was honored above quick conclusions and easy answers. The Academy taught that philosophy was not information to be acquired, but transformation to be undergone. Not knowledge to be possessed, but journey to be traveled. Not destination to be reached, but path to be walked endlessly toward a horizon that retreats as we approach. The stars wheel overhead as they did for Plato. The questions remain unanswered, and somewhere in the darkness of every mind that wonders, the conversation continues, quieter than speech, deeper than thought, older than the grove where it began, and younger than this present moment when we wonder as they wondered what lies beyond the firelight's flickering shadows. On the Acropolis above Athens, where temples had stood since before memory recorded their building, where the sacred rock rose from the surrounding plain like an altar raised to heaven. The Parthenon was constructed in the 5th century before the Common Era, a structure so perfectly proportioned that it has defined architectural beauty ever since. Dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess of wisdom and warfare, protector of the city that chose her over Poseidon and named itself for her gift. We climb the sacred rock in the hour after dawn, when marble catches the first light and seems to glow from within, when the centuries collapse and we see the temple as it was when Athena dwelt within. The building rose from the ashes of an earlier temple that the Persians had burned when they captured Athens during the invasion of 480 BCE. The Athenians had fled their city rather than surrender, had watched from across the strait as smoke rose from their destroyed sacred places, had vowed that if the gods granted them victory, they would rebuild what had been ruined more gloriously than before. The victory came at Salamis, where the Athenian fleet, built from silver recently discovered in Athenian mines, destroyed the Persian navy and turned the tide of the war. The vow was kept, though not immediately. It took decades to accumulate the resources, to develop the plans, to gather the sculptors and architects who could execute a vision that would surpass anything the Greeks had built before. Pericles, the Athenian leader whose name the age bears, oversaw the construction. The funds came from the Delian League, an alliance formed to defend against future Persian attacks, whose treasury had been moved from the island of Delos to Athens for safekeeping, and then spent on Athenian projects that benefited the alliance's leader far more than its members. The Parthenon was thus monument to both Athenian devotion and Athenian imperialism, a temple built partly with money that should have belonged to others. Its beauty inseparable from the complicated politics that made such beauty possible. The architects Ictinus and Callicrates designed a structure that embodied mathematical harmony in every dimension. The columns are not perfectly straight. They swell slightly in the middle. A technique called entasis that corrects for an optical illusion that would make straight columns appear thinner at the center. The floor curves imperceptibly upward at the center, compensating for another optical illusion that would make a flat floor appear to sag. The columns lean slightly inward. The corner columns are thicker than the others. The spaces between columns vary according to position. Every detail calculated to make the building appear perfect, even though achieving the appearance of perfection required departing from actual geometric regularity. The sculptor Phidias designed the decorative program and created the centerpiece, a 40-foot statue of Athena made of gold and ivory, her skin of pale ivory gleaming, her robes of gold hammered thin over a wooden core, her eyes of precious gems, her shield decorated with battle scenes, Nike, the goddess of victory, standing in her palm, offering triumph to those the goddess favored. The statue has been lost for over 1,000 years, melted, perhaps, for its gold, or destroyed in one of the many disasters that have befallen the building. But ancient descriptions convey something of its overwhelming presence, its size and splendor making visitors feel they stood before divinity itself. The frieze that encircled the building depicted the Panathenaic procession, the festival held every 4 years when Athenians brought a new robe to dress Athena's ancient wooden cult statue. The procession included mounted youths, chariots, sacrificial animals, elders carrying olive branches, maidens bearing sacred objects, all of Athens represented in marble, frozen in eternal approach to the goddess, perpetually honoring her without ever completing the gesture of honor. The metaphors depicted battles between Greeks and enemies, both mortal and mythological, against Amazons, against centaurs, against the giants who had challenged the gods. The pediments showed Athena's birth from Zeus's head and her contest with Poseidon for patronage of Athens, cosmic events that established her significance, that explained why the city bore her name. The Parthenon has survived longer than it should have, given everything that has happened to it. It was converted to a Christian church in the Byzantine era, the interior modified, the meanings reinterpreted. It became a mosque under Ottoman rule, a minaret added to one corner. It was used as an ammunition storage site by Ottoman forces defending Athens against Venetian attack, and then hit by Venetian artillery in 1687, the ammunition exploding, the center of the building destroyed in a single catastrophic moment. The Venetians tried to remove sculptures from the ruins, dropped them, shattered them. Lord Elgin removed more sculptures in the early 19th century, taking them to London where they remain controversial to this day. Fire, explosion, looting, weather, pollution. The building has endured assaults that should have destroyed it entirely. Yet it remains, damaged but present, demanding attention across millennia. We sit among the fallen columns as evening approaches, watching the light change on marble that has watched the light change for 25 centuries. The statue is gone. The roof is gone. The paint that once colored the sculptures, bright reds and blues and golds, has faded to the pale stone that modern visitors mistake for the intended appearance. What remains is enough to demonstrate what the Parthenon was, the highest achievement of a civilization at its highest moment, the embodiment of ideas about order and proportion and divine favor that shaped everything that came afterward. The chapter closes in the gathered shadows of the sacred rock, where Athena no longer dwells, but where something of her presence seems to linger. Wisdom and warfare, craft and strategy, the particular combination of intelligence and power that the Athenians worshipped because they recognized it in themselves. The temple was prayer-made stone, the belief that beauty and wisdom and divine protection could be built and could endure. The belief was partly justified. The Parthenon has endured, though the civilization that built it has not, though the goddess it honored is worshipped by no one, though everything the Athenians thought would last forever has passed away, except this ruin that refuses to fall completely, that stands against the sky as witness to what humans can build when they believe the gods are watching, in the final stillness of the Greek imagination, where heroes and gods alike eventually found rest, where the stories that had sustained civilization for 1,000 years gradually grew quieter and finally fell silent. We discover the truth that the Greeks understood better than any culture before or since. That all things end, that all glories fade, that the only immortality possible is the immortality of memory, of song, of stories told beside fires by those who never witnessed what they describe but who carry the flame, because carrying flames is what humans do against the darkness that waits for everything. We stand in the ruins of the ancient world as twilight gathers, seeing what remains and understanding what has been lost, letting the silence teach us what the stories have been saying all along. The Greeks understood mortality not as tragedy, but as the condition that made life precious. The gods were immortal, and because they were immortal, nothing they did truly mattered. They could not risk, could not sacrifice, could not love with the intensity that came from knowing love would end. Achilles was offered a choice, a long life of obscurity or a short life of glory. He chose glory, not because he preferred death, but because he understood that meaning required mortality, that heroism required stakes, that the brightness that illuminated the Iliad came from the certainty that the heroes would not live to grow old, would not fade into comfortable irrelevance, would burn fierce and brief and be remembered forever precisely because they ended. The myths never promised happy endings. Orpheus lost Eurydice. Oedipus blinded himself and wandered in exile. Ajax went mad and fell on his own sword. The house of Atreus consumed itself through generation after generation of murder and revenge. The pattern was not pessimism, but realism. The recognition that life contained both joy and sorrow, that triumph was followed by defeat, that the hero's journey did not conclude in permanent victory, but in return to ordinary existence in aging and death, in the surrender of all that had been won. But the surrender was not complete. The story survived. Homer sang of Achilles 30 centuries ago, and Achilles still fights on the plain before Troy, still rages over his wounded honor, still grieves for Patroclus, still achieves the terrible beauty of mortality fully accepted. Socrates died in 399 BCE, drinking the hemlock that Athens demanded, and Socrates still asks questions, still disturbs the comfortable, still demonstrates that wisdom begins with the admission of ignorance. The temples have fallen, the statues have been broken, the priests have forgotten the rituals, but the myths endure, the legends persist, the stories that shaped Greek consciousness continue shaping ours. We walk through the ruins as the last light fades, past theatres where tragedies were performed for audiences who wept at sorrows they knew were their own, past temples where prayers rose to gods who were perhaps only the shapes humanity gave to its deepest hopes and fears, past marketplaces where philosophers argued about truth with passion that suggested they knew they would never quite find it. The stones remember what we have forgotten. The silence holds what words could never quite capture. The emptiness is not absence, but presence transformed. The presence of everything that was lived and loved and lost, and somehow preserved in the very loss itself. The Greeks taught us that the universe was not made for human comfort, that the gods were not necessarily good, that justice did not always prevail. They taught us that asking questions mattered more than finding answers. that the journey was more important than the destination, that wisdom lay not in certainty, but in the courage to live without certainty. They taught us that love could lead into the underworld, that beauty could call us to our deaths, that knowledge could be dangerous enough to destroy those who sought it. They taught us that stories save what nothing else can save. Achilles is dust, but the Iliad still sings of him. Athens fell to Sparta, to Macedon, to Rome, to 1,000 conquerors whose names are now forgotten. But the Academy's conversations continue in every school. The Parthenon's proportions are repeated in buildings around the world. The myths that shaped Greek childhood still shape ours. The gods may have been imagination. The heroes may have been exaggeration. The monsters may have been metaphor. But the truths they carried were real, are real, will remain real as long as humans wonder about their place in a universe that seems both beautiful and indifferent, both meaningful and silent. The chapter closes without resolution, fading into the darkness that the myths always acknowledged was coming. Not the darkness of despair, but the darkness of rest, of completion, of the long sleep that follows every day. The stories end because all stories end. The silence comes because all words eventually fall silent. But something remains in the silence, something that the Greeks heard in the spaces between notes of the lyre, something that Orpheus almost brought back from the underworld, something that the philosophers glimpsed in the realm of the forms, something that Athena whispered to those who worshipped her with wisdom rather than sacrifice. The legends of ancient Greece are over. The gods have retreated to whatever realm gods inhabit when no one believes in them any longer. The heroes have become stories. The stories have become myths. The myths have become something deeper than either, permanent patterns in the human soul that will be rediscovered under different names whenever humanity faces the same questions the Greeks faced and sought meaning in the same darkness. The silence holds. The stars wheel overhead as they did when Homer sang, when Plato taught, when Athens stood in splendor and Troy burned and the sirens called from their rocky shore. The silence is not empty. The silence is full of everything that has been said and will be said again. Everything that has been lost and will be found again. Everything that ends and, in ending, somehow never quite ends at all. Sleep comes now. The myths fade into dreams, and in the dreams the legends continue. Olympus still rises into clouds. The labyrinth still turns back upon itself. The river still flows toward the sea that remembers everything we forget. The stories are over. The stories never end. The silence holds both truths, and in the holding becomes sacred, becomes sufficient, becomes the only possible ending for stories that taught us there are no endings, only transformations, only the eternal return of what we thought we had lost, only the sunrise that follows every darkness, only the awakening that follows every sleep. The legends rest now, and so do we.